What's up everybody, it's Izzy, and in this video I want to do a re-review of the conjugate method. Now, I've already done a 30 to 45 minute video on this subject before that you can find on the main Powerlifting to Win channel, and I think all the arguments that I made there are still pretty much valid. However, I have some new insight to add to this topic, so let's just go ahead and talk about it. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar, the conjugate method was basically invented by Louis Simmons of Westside Barbell. And generally speaking, and there's lots of different ways to run conjugate, but generally speaking, it's an upper-lower split program, training 4 days per week, where you have 2 max effort sessions where you go very, very heavy, and then you have 2 speed work sessions where you're obviously using lighter weights, but you're intending to move very quickly. So, I am not a fan of the conjugate method for a whole variety of reasons. Number one is that for raw lifters, I don't think it's necessary to use all of the different accommodating resistance tools that are so heavily emphasized in most conjugate programs. This is particularly for raw powerlifters. I'm not talking about strength training in general. In geared lifting, the strength curve is such that the hardest part of the movement is in the middle or at the top because of the way that the gear helps you. And when you add tons of bands and chains, it has the same effect as when you're using gear, making the top and the middle harder. And this is great because it allows geared lifters to not have to use their full equipment as often. So they don't have to get into their shirts and suits and things quite so often to still get a good training effect. But for raw lifters, all of the emphasis on end range and middle range isn't as useful because raw lifters are generally speaking weakest at the bottom on all 3 lifts. Okay, now you don't have to do speed work if you're going to do the conjugate method. You could do volume work instead, and I think that's a great start because, like I said, I don't think speed work is very useful because of the focus on the different part of the range of motion and due to the fact that, honestly, in powerlifting, it doesn't really matter how fast you are. There's this idea that if you have more momentum going into the sticking point, you have a better chance to complete the lift, but that's not really from you getting faster, having more momentum going into the sticking point. That's basically from you being stronger in the bottom part of the range of motion. So you're going to get more acceleration and more speed in the bottom end range of motion if you're stronger. So learning how to be explosive is almost more of a skill than you actually getting faster. And that's why I think sometimes people can benefit from doing speed work a couple of times so they understand how to volitionally explode, so how to make themselves be explosive. But it's not because they're actually getting significantly faster, and it's not because getting significantly faster is all that important for powerlifting. Now, my biggest criticism of conjugate is the lack of exposure to the competition movements using competition technique. So for those of you guys who are unfamiliar, in the conjugate method, with your 2 max effort days, generally you're rotating through variations. So you have an upper body max effort day and a lower body max effort day. For your upper body max effort day, you might rotate between enough exercises that you only repeat them every 2 or 3 or 4 months. That means you're doing a new exercise almost every time that you do, the max effort method. You very rarely go back to the exercises that you've used in the past. That's part of the method. And the argument there is that because you rotate the movement so often, you can max out. Now, this raises an interesting question, and it's basically, what's more specific to powerlifting? A 1-rep close grip bench press to a 2 board, or a bunch of sub-maximal sets of, say, 6 reps on the competition bench? Well, you could have an argument about that, and it's a good argument to be had, but in most people's experience, what carries over more is the more frequent competition work rather than rotating all of these variations that may or may not even address your particular sticking points as a lifter. All right, the other problem with it is that because it's an upper-lower split, the frequency is going to be pretty low. And while that's perfectly appropriate for large male lifters, for most natural lifters who are middleweights or even smaller, this doesn't tend to work out as well. They need more frequency in order to get in all of the volume that they need to progress optimally. Now, further, because there's only 2 max effort days per week and 1 is upper body, that means for your lower body max effort, what you're going to end up doing is alternating between squats and deadlifts, and sometimes even good mornings. So you might only deadlift truly heavy, once every 3 weeks. And that can be a real problem as far as competition specificity and making sure that you're getting enough exposure to really become proficient technically and otherwise at the deadlift and at the squat. So what I've seen just anecdotally in people who use the conjugate method is that quite a few people do really well with their deadlift on the conjugate Some people improve on their bench, and almost nobody has their best squat results from the conjugate, from what I've seen. And here's the reason why I say that happens. For one, in the squat, like I said, the frequency is just low. You're doing speed work, and more often than not, rather than straight volume work on your lower body dynamic effort day. So your only exposure, really, weekly exposure to squatting is with light weights against accommodating resistance, and that's just lacking in specificity. So when you compare that to a program where you're squatting 2 to 3 times a week with the competition form for volume, the volume just doesn't compare, the specificity of the training just doesn't compare, and most people just simply get better results from squatting more often than that and doing more volume on the squat. Right? Because when you're only doing a max effort squat once every 2 to 3 weeks, and then your other squat day is just dynamic effort, you end up having poor technique. There's all sorts of issues that come up. Now with bench press, some people do get better results from the conjugate method, and I think one of those reasons is that the conjugate method gives them a lot more variety, and sometimes people are too hyper-specific with their upper body training. So in the conjugate method, you'll get more variety, and you'll do tons of hypertrophy work, and you don't do it after squatting or deadlifting. So the combination of all of these things, of people benching while they're fresh, doing more variety, and doing more hypertrophy work, usually means that they gain more muscle, even though the frequency is probably suboptimal at only 2 days per week for the upper body. So in the long run, if you're talking about optimized training, I think that 3 times per week or even 4 times per week works better for the upper body. But when you're comparing the conjugate method to stuff like 531 and novice programs that have little hypertrophy work and little variety, sometimes the conjugate method can kick ass in that regard. Now, there's a pretty large subset of people that do really, really well with their deadlift on the conjugate method, and I think this is because, in general, the deadlift is the one lift that tags along the best in terms of progress. Meaning that if you increase your general strength, and you do more hypertrophy work for your back and your lower body, you'll get a lot of carryover on your deadlift. The deadlift is a very intensive exercise in terms of recovery. It can be hard to recover from. Some people will argue this, but it tends to be true for most people. Conventional deadlift is probably the hardest lift to recover from. And you can do it more frequently if you choose to pull sumo. That's absolutely true. But still, most people only pull once or twice per week, whereas most people squat 2 to 3 times per week and bench, 3 or 4 times per week. So I think with the deadlift, you just kind of have a confluence of factors that leads to good training. And that is that people finally stop overtraining the deadlift when they do conjugate. They do tons of other variety and general strength work to build up their general strength base. So they get to perform the deadlift when they're more fresh on their max effort day. Their squat isn't interfering as much with their deadlift training. It has a lot less of a negative impact. So there's more of a deadlift focus because there's less of a squat focus. And overall, like I said, there's a lot of general strength work in there. There's a lot of hypertrophy work in there. And together, combined with some of the exposure to light deadlifting through speed work, a lot of times people are getting more deadlift volume than they ever have, less squat volume than they ever have, more general strength work than they ever have, more hypertrophy work than they ever have, and combined it leads to a better deadlift. But again, though, overall, I don't recommend the conjugate method for raw lifters. There's good points. There's world records that have been set with the conjugate method. It works great for some people. But for smaller, raw, natural lifters, I think there's a lot of better options out there that have more volume and more frequency while still giving you enough variety and, differences in movements to build up your weak points to get a better general strength base and build your hypertrophy. So overall, I'm not as negative about the conjugate method as I was in the past. I see utility in it and people do get stronger on it, and I'm not going to deny that. But it's still not something I would recommend. I think it just violates too many sound training principles. And it's really kind of a extreme approach that works best only in certain situations. Anyways, guys, that's my take on the conjugate method. Hope you enjoyed the video. As always, my friends, good luck with your training and have a nice day. Peace.